Okay, thank you very much for joining us today on this very windy and rainy and blustery day, wherever you are in the UK or abroad there. Welcome to this joint Bovill and Elephants Don't Forget webinar, where we discuss with subject matter experts and leading authorities the key issues that are impacting and affecting regulated firms. My name is Philip Allen. I'm delighted to welcome you to this 60-minute webinar on redefining your approach to vulnerable customers for 2022. I'm delighted to be joined by Frank Brown, Risk and Transformation Practice Lead at Bovill, as well as Adrian Harvey from the AI-powered knowledge retention firm Elephants Don't Forget.
Hello.
Hi.
Brilliant. We rehearsed that beforehand as well. We welcome your questions, obviously, throughout the webinar. Just click on the Q&A speech bubbles as denoted at the top or the bottom of your screen, and please post your questions there. And please note that you can actually send your questions without revealing your firm or your name there. So that'd be great if you could participate in that. We've got a couple of polls that we would love you to participate in. That gives us a feel and flavor of where you are on your customer journey and your vulnerability customer journey there. And it'd be great to have that interaction and participation. You can also use the chat function, which enables you to exchange views and also knowledge share with your fellow colleagues there. As said before, we will have a PDF version of the slides available to you after the webinar here, and that will give you a reference point alongside a recording of the webinar itself there. We wanted to kickstart off because we've got a lot of information to cover and not a lot of time to do this. Again, I want to turn to you, Frank, on this. You've been looking at this issue for a number of years now, and the regulator have now put this front and center of pretty much everything that they're doing in their approach to conduct and culture, but primarily it's been led by vulnerability, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back a good few years with the regulator, and you can see some degree of frustration with them through the iterations of that in their view, firms are not quite getting this and are not quite addressing the customer outcomes issues around vulnerable customers. So the guidance came out, and the guidance is pretty detailed, pretty comprehensive, and you know, I expect most people have read it, but have another read of it certainly, and get to grips with what the underlying points that they're making. And we have here on the screen there's sort of 4 high-level principles of what the expectations are. So understanding the needs of the target markets, the customer base, having that honest assessment of who are the people that we are expecting to buy our products, to use our services. And we'll talk in a minute about the sort of different types of vulnerability, but looking at your target market across that broad range of potential vulnerabilities is incredibly important. Then making sure the staff within your organization know what they're doing when it comes to vulnerability. And that means all staff who are touching the customer. I mean, we see an awful lot, and we'll address this a little bit more around, yes, I've got my frontline staff covered, so therefore I've done vulnerability. Whereas the guidance is much broader than that, much more comprehensive. So making sure that everybody who can touch the customer, who can impact the customer, fully understands what's going on. Moving through the third one there, it is not just that conversation with the customer, it is the product design, the service communication, the comms, the provision of service, how you deliver that service to the customer. So again, not thinking too narrowly about, if I have a conversation with my customer on the call center, I've got this covered. It is that sort of backstream elements of it that need to be covered as well. And the final one there, and I think one of the most important ones, is this monitoring and assessment. Are you doing this properly? What are the issues within your organization? How are vulnerable customers being treated? And this goes towards the high-level principles. So, general effectiveness of your management and your competencies, obviously treating customers fairly, and also SMCR as well. It's a truism, I think, when you're looking at papers from the regulator. If they start talking about principles, generally speaking, that means they're intending enforcement action. because they tend to enforce on principles rather than handbook breaches. So that monitoring, that assessment, that senior management knowing what's going on is incredibly important.
There's a lot to unpack in there, and as you say, we'll be just focusing on a few key issues throughout the webinar there. Adrian, I just want to pick up on what Frank has said in point number 4, monitoring and assessment there. Clearly, the MI from that vulnerability customer journey is going to be critical to evaluate and to evidence progress in this area for regulated firms.
Yeah, you would think so. I'm really curious to see. I mean, we've got some polls coming up to see how the audience respond in terms of how well they or firms feel that they are dealing with this issue of vulnerability. From our point of view, as a firm who serves the FinServ community, vulnerable customer, it is a challenge. It's a considerable challenge. I don't hear many firms who say, look, we've got this covered, we've got all the evidence we need. And it's really interesting hearing Frank make the point that the regulator is talking about principles, because for me, this is a hot topic for 22, and it doesn't surprise me not so many people on the webinar. This ability to be able to evidence, and provide that management information or data, which the regulator will demand, I think is what's going to separate the firms who should be sleeping easy and those that shouldn't.
Frank, how have firms reacted to the guidance and the approach? Because the guidance was issued Q1 of this year, and it was immediate, wasn't it? There. How have they responded? How have Bovill clients reacted to that?
I mean, generally across the market, I'd have to say not particularly well, really. I mean, there is still a very narrow focus on what is a vulnerable customer, and equally a very narrow focus on what, how should I support a vulnerable customer? So people are still very much, I've trained my call center. Those guys know, I've got a large print version of my terms and conditions, so therefore I've got vulnerable customers covered. There's broader considerations about your go-to-market strategy, your approach, what senior managements are doing about this, what information senior managements are getting, and the broad range of vulnerabilities. And I know we're going to talk about that in a moment, is unfortunately not something people are getting. And I think the regulator is aware of this, definitely.
So our first poll question here is just listing out the expectations from the regulator, and it would be great if you could participate in this poll, and therefore just give us a sense check on where you are in terms of like where you are meeting the expectations of the regulator, and also where some slight challenges have happened, where you're struggling with. We can pick up those points, and if you want to elaborate on those, you can do so through the chat function as well there. So yeah, participate in the poll there. I'll just bring that up for you to there. Can you see the poll? Is that can panelists, can you see the poll on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, right. Let's relaunch that on there. Okay, there you go. So the FCA's guidance contains 6 expectations, which are designed to ensure that all customers are treated fairly, regardless of their circumstances. Which of the expectations are proving most challenging in your firm there? And Frank, you talked about the guidance landed, but didn't necessarily land well there. Is that because regulated firms don't necessarily see a need to invest time and effort into current practices and processes there because they think that they are sorted, or they're addressing the concerns and the expectations of the regulator, or is there something more?
I mean, there is, firms have an awful lot to do. You've got running your business and making profit. You've also got complying with the rules and regulation, and there tends to be perhaps an over focus on on handbook regs. So, Conc 3.52 or whatever, as opposed to the more higher level things like principles and equally things like guidance. So, yes, they put guidance on the front of it, but people should be very mindful that if they do go to enforcement, the regulator will pretty much say, "We told you this." So. In some respects, some firms have sort of underplayed the significance of it, underplayed the importance of it, because it wasn't a change in a rule book that they could point at. So that's a concern. Yeah.
Both of you picked up on the issue, and I think the audience has done so in this poll here. Monitoring and evaluation is a real challenge. 63% of the audience saying that's as the lead answer there, but 34% saying practical action is a challenge there. Are you surprised by monitoring and evaluation, Adrian?
No. Actually, that's really quite reflective of what I would expect. The customer service aspect, I think, will come out through this webinar. I think most firms that I speak to think they've got the customer service aspect, the direct. It's especially if it's telephone based. And one of the questions was actually about digital journeys. So Frank, you might want to cover that at a later point. But I'm not surprised that the customer service bit is that firms are feeling comfy about that. I'm absolutely not at all surprised. Monitoring and evaluation is stressing individuals. Taking practical action for me is a function of the monitoring and evaluation, because my supposition would be how I know that we're not brilliant at this. Ergo, what practical action can I take to make us better? And that's not clear, and it can be a considerable challenge. And hopefully, you'll get something from this webinar. But Frank and I will hopefully give you some ideas. Frank's got some great content.
Clearly, the lead answer, monitoring and evaluation there. Why are firms struggling with this in particular, Frank?
I mean, it is an issue across the board. I mean, if you have honest conversations with firms around where challenges are, then monitoring and evaluation is pretty high on the list for all aspects of it. So that sort of gap between the front end, the sharp end, and senior management is always a difficult one to bridge, and particularly with something amorphous like vulnerability. Something that's sometimes difficult to put your finger on, get your arms around, being able to establish who are my vulnerable customers, how well am I treating my vulnerable customers, what issues are they having. And Adrian mentioned the sort of digital early journey, which we'll talk about a little bit in a moment. With so many firms moving in that direction, a lot of fintech, a lot of new startups, and equally old bricks and mortar firms pushing that direction, understanding vulnerability within a digital-only journey is incredibly difficult.
And when we look at vulnerability, worth reminding firms how the regulator is defining vulnerability, and not just from a historic mindset of health or age factors. It is much bigger than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is this comes directly from the guidance, and it's a great slide. And again, it sort of reflects my point that there is a lot of good information in the guidance. And generally speaking, if you look at it sort of left to right, most people are fairly comfortable with the left-hand side of the page in terms of, physical disability, hearing and visual impairment, and equally into some of the life events like retirement, bereavement, fine, okay. But as we progress further along the right, firms are struggling with it, certainly struggling to understand it, struggling to spot it, and struggling to do something effective about it. The one that I always focus on and always push with firms is top right there, sort of low confidence, low understanding of financial services. So this unsophistication of customers is the sort of unacknowledged, uncontrolled, unmonitored vulnerability that we're seeing.
And just can I signpost you to a number of individuals who have posted, and please do keep your questions coming in, also your comments in the chat, because they're very useful for us to guide the discussion according to your needs as well. When you talk about capability in that far right hand side, Adrian, the regulator, there's an expectation for everybody in the organization to be aligned. And you talked about an authentic culture of learning to support your approach to vulnerability. Do you want to unpack that in a bit more detail?
Yes, I was going to. I think you covered off we're getting so many good questions that are, I think, probably require a more detailed answer. We might choose, Philip, to do what we did in one of the previous ones, and actually give written answers to some of these questions, because just to distribute that. So yes, the point was the authenticity of the organisation's approach to employee training and competence, and whether or not let's just take a really simple example. To some extent, to hold up the mirror conversation, ask yourself the question: we've trained our people. Have you trained them to the extent that they would individually understand how this matrix impacts them in their job? My sense is, well, actually, the data would suggest that is not the case, because when we engage with organizations for the first time, we're able to cut through that belief and land evidence of actual competence and capability in the workforce. And it is always far lower than any organization would prefer.
And Frank, you can't, in this slide, fit people in a box, can you? Vulnerability certainly has many, many faces, and this is proving a real challenge for firms to understand, but also to act and respond on. And like Adrian has said, to have a proactive approach to learning, to respond to situational vulnerability and inherent vulnerability is a challenge that all firms have to address.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's thinking about vulnerability on those two sort of angles. So your inherent vulnerability is often the kind of thing you can see. So, older people, physical disabilities, etc., etc. So fairly easy to spot, and also fairly consistent, or sort of shifting relatively slowly over time. Your situation vulnerability is the unexpected events. So, the bereavement is the simple one, but income shocks, taking on caring responsibility, that kind of thing. And it's been mindful of the fact that the interrelationship of the two is important. Somebody who has a lot of inherent vulnerabilities is going to be much less able to shoulder a situational vulnerability. So when something else crops up in their life, it's going to be much more problematic for them. So not thinking about this as a static view. I'm on the working party for a trade association on vulnerable customers, and somebody was raising a suggestion the other day about having effectively a sort of questionnaire with customers when they first join you, first become a client, around, not bluntly, are you vulnerable, but what additional help would you want from us? And my feedback was, yes, great in principle, but vulnerability is not a fixed state. It changes. So just because they weren't at the start doesn't mean they're not going to be in the future. And conceptually thinking about this similarly to your business continuity exercises, the sort of, cascading issues happening, knock-on issues happening, which need to be considered, and the resilience flexes with customers, definitely.
Frank, if I can just build on that to make the situation more complex. How do you spot somebody is physically disabled if it's through web chat?
Yeah, without question. The digital journey is an incredibly difficult one. There's two sides of it. There is the assessment at the start of what's our target market like, who are the people we're likely to be getting as customers, and you're obviously not going to spot things like disability particularly well in there. As you get into that journey with the customer, having that initial signposting with them around that's very proactive, do you need any more help, what else can we do for you, and having that on-ramp, that off-ramp within the process to get them out to a call center to talk to somebody. And there are a number of tools which are quite useful around tracking what customers are doing on a website. The mouse is going all over the place, they're spending too much time on a slide, on a page, and having your pop-ups, your chat boxes, is there anything we can help you with? Do you need any support at this point, is very useful.
Just if I can put you on the spot, talking about that evidencing, if I am an online only or digital only business, to what extent is the regulator looking at me as a high risk organization in relation to vulnerability? And to what extent is the regulator saying, you know what, you lot, I'm expecting a way higher level of proactive activity in relation of identifying, sorting and helping vulnerable customers?
Yeah, without question. And before we started, we were talking about a particular online provider who will remain nameless. But if you have chosen to be an online only provider, and if you are expecting or anticipating, a large volume of customers going through, the onus is on you to make sure that the customers are getting treated fairly. I mean, across TCF in general it is, and Consumer Duty will emphasize that, but there will be not a lot of sympathy from the regulator that you did not recognize the inherent risks within your customer journey and the inherent risks within your customer base, and you didn't do something about it.
Good answer, thank you very much.
As you know, Frank, it's not the sole preserve of a customer contact center or call center, or even the vulnerability team to meet the expectations of the regulators' approach to vulnerability. There, you've highlighted the vulnerability lens over every single part of the customer journey is essential, but I'd like to broaden it out to actually a whole approach to cultural, through the cultural lens there, and the two go hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a quote about, I can't remember who it's by, about society. The measure of a society is how we treat the least amongst us as opposed to the best amongst us. And I think that kind of thing is a useful concept here. Vulnerable customers should be a principle and a focus across everything you do as an organization. And it is a very useful yardstick for how good you are at TCF, how good you are at applying the principles and applying things like COCON. And without question, the regulator will use it as a yardstick for assessing your underlying culture, your underlying sort of processes, procedures, your purpose as an organization. So I wasn't going to use the term, but taking a holistic view is incredibly important.
Yeah, no swearing on this webinar. But isn't there a case to both of you? There's the MI that we have, or firms have, but the MI that you want. A couple of people in the chat have said, well, look, I've got existing processes, I've got this existing MI and data, but not too sure whether it actually fits the expectations of what the regulator is asking us to do, or actually giving our compliance team the support and the guidance to be able to adjust our policies accordingly. So there's the MI on the left-hand side that we have, but the MI that we want there. Do you have any thoughts and opinions, both of you, on how firms can actually move from what they have to what they really absolutely want to desire to demonstrate those reasonable steps under SMCR?
Yeah, I mean, all MI, and this is not just vulnerable customers, should be driven by the identification of risks. So, you start with your risk appetite, your risk register, et cetera, what is potentially going to go wrong in my organization? Then I need to build a suite of MI to establish whether it's going wrong or not and put the tolerances on it. So, MI should be top down conceptually in terms of what do I need to measure within the organization, then obviously bottom up operationally, and what am I actually measuring. So with vulnerable customers, the challenge for the development of the MI is, what do I need to give myself comfort that my vulnerable customers are being treated correctly, properly, and what do I need across all vulnerabilities, the entirety of the customer journey, to make sure that I'm comfortable.
Yeah, Philip. So I'll focus in on the employee competency bit, because anonymous attendee was asking a question, quite rightly so, about the level of competence of an employee to be able to offer support to a vulnerable customer. And this comes back to, this for me is a cultural red flag. It's like, if your approach to employee vulnerability training is a 30-minute online tutorial, refreshed every year, then there is absolutely no way your employees are going to be qualified to deal with vulnerable customers as they may present themselves through whatever channel you engage with those customers. And you know, I just think we need to recognize that. And from an MI point of view, as an organization, you need, I mean, it's very hard to do manually, right? But there's lots of tools out there. You need to understand the actual level of competency of your individual employees in relation to customer vulnerability. And then you need to understand the gap. It's not a team sport, by the way. It's at an individual advisor level or agent level, whatever you want to say. And then you've got to close that gap. So from an MI perspective, you need to map that, and you need to monitor it, and you need to close the gap. You need to improve the gap. That's what I mean by about authentic, having an authentic approach. And if I were a regulator, I would be asking questions around what steps are you taking to ensure that your people are genuinely competent and able to offer help and support to vulnerable customers as they appear through your customer journey. Awkward tumbleweed moment, I suspect, for lots of firms. Yeah,
which leads us nicely into the process, Frank. Where are firms particularly struggling with on points 1 to 6 there? And at this point, I'd love to get a sense check from the audience through the chat about where they, perhaps have challenges there. Is it operational resilience, number 6? If so, just put number 6 in the chat. Is it frontline staff, like Adrian's talk, number 1, or is it 2 and 3? Frank, let's go to you first. Where's this a challenge?
I mean, certainly in 2, it's not just frontline staff is something that firms struggle with. 4, and we'll unpack that a little bit more, the digital journey 1, 5, outsourced providers, again, inherent risks there. So they are the key ones. Yeah.
And yeah, thank you very much for your answers on that one there. People are saying 2 is a struggle. UX, design, IT, alignment and transformation there. Kevin has said outsourced providers, third-party providers there. Adrian, from your point of view, where's it going wrong?
Sorry, I've got to take myself off mute. I was smirking. Where's it going wrong?
Where can it be improved? Let's be positive.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, if they're honest publicly or privately on this webinar, are looking at this, seeing a very complicated issue that has many, by default, has many facets. And it may very well be that certain businesses are performing better at some of those facets than others. And if I were a digitally based business, or a business that did all of its work through intermediaries, I'm already seeing a higher and more challenging vulnerable customer issue. But at the end of the day, your first line of defense is your people, whether you are a digitally based business or whether you are a telephone based or face-to-face even. So your people are a critical component of how you address this. And I'll keep going back to, if your approach to training and supporting your own people is wanting, then I suspect your results for customer vulnerability, whichever one of those 6 most apply to your business, will be weak.
Frank, you picked up on the point. I think many people on this webinar through the chat have also picked up on this. It's about product governance, isn't it? It starts off with product creation and product marketing there. Firms are going to need to reassess their approach to both those product designs and every aspect of the customer journey.
Yeah, if we could just flip back one before we move on to product, because there's a couple of good questions in the chat. I mean, there's a nice broad ranging one there. Can a firm operate a digital only proposition, which I think is a good question. Yes, but you will have to spend money on it. And there is very much a very clear point about cost of compliance. You're running a comparatively cheap operation with a digital only one, so you need to spend money on that off ramp to a call center, and equally on understanding customer behavior during the journey they're on. And I think a sensible thing to consider is some pre-testing with customers as well. So, building your model, and we talked about IT UX design, and most IT UX people are frustrated games designers. So they like, they like customers to rush through this as quickly as possible, which is all nice, but not great for vulnerable customers. So getting some live insights into what people who are vulnerable actually experience from your website is incredibly valuable. Yeah, so sorry I've taken you backwards, but we can
no, that's all right. Keep your questions coming in, because there's some really good ones. We'll spend a little more time going through the questions on this webinar, but as Adrian said, we'll also take many of the questions offline to give you a thorough answer to this. So we're talking product governance in this slide, Frank, and also TCF. Worth focusing on this for a little bit of time, because the regulator is expecting every step of that CX journey to actually have that vulnerability lens, as we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned it briefly later on, but I'll say it here. Your approach to vulnerable customers is not an addition to TCF; it's an articulation of TCF. It's a demonstration of how you're treating people, a sort of acid test. So in terms of product, a number of people will be under prod rules in the FCA handbook, but you've got the TCF outcome too, which covers suitability of products, and thinking about vulnerability and baking in vulnerability across all stages of the life cycle. So again, it comes back to the knowing who your target market is, knowing the inherent vulnerabilities within that, looking at whether the product can, one, can the product be sold? Two, can it be sold down that channel? So you think of some investment products as examples. There's some products where a digital only channel is just not appropriate at all. You have to have an advisor sitting with that customer to make it work properly. So, channel and product are very much interrelated, and equally thinking about where you are in the chain. And I think we had a couple of points on that in the chat there about, I'm getting customers from somebody. How do I know they're vulnerable or not? It is your responsibility at the end of the day. And again, not a lot of sympathy from the regulator. So making sure you do the checks to the extent, and equally making sure that culturally and operationally, any partners you're working with are absolutely on the same page as you.
Doesn't this throw the opportunity up for more innovation and for in product development and design there? So there's an opportunity here. You talked about market testing. You talked about making sure that the UX is thoroughly tested and future-proof for existing and future markets. That provides opportunities, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's clear benefits in doing the right thing, and it's often overlooked when firms are sort of confronted with changes in regulation, and they sort of throw their arms up and go, well, this is annoying, this is going to be expensive. But if you look at product and also you look at process, why would you not want to know how your process works, how it impacts your customers? Why would you not want to know whether your product is suitable for customers? So using it as an opportunity is definitely beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, you've highlighted some examples here, and do you want to pick one or two from this slide about examples where there are opportunities and where there may be challenges, or where there's firms that have you've come across where they've really posed these questions and probably need to come to an appropriate answer?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about digital a couple of times. I mean, the investment space is a tricky one, and it comes back to my point I was making on the sort of table of vulnerability, this idea of financial sophistication. So there's an example there of sort of inheritance. Just because a person has a lot of money does not mean they understand what they're going to do with it. And we've seen some particularly problematic products in the marketplace. We have Kim Kardashian advertising crypto, and you really think, what were you thinking in that respect? We've seen a huge uptick in crypto and various other sort of risky investments from young men who watched Wolf of Wall Street a couple of times, think they can day trade And, you know, they are problematic. I mean, another one which is common is buy now, pay later. And that tends to be used by a younger demographic, a younger market. It may be their first lending product, their first bit of credit they've used, and they don't understand it at all. They don't understand the implications. I think somebody did ask a specific question about lending and the idea of the sort of affordability checks that's happening within that. And if you go back to the table on types of vulnerability, things like, you know, income shocks, for example, that goes across to the sustainability concept within lending rules, that yes, the customer can borrow the money today, but can they repay over the life of this loan? What's the impact going to be? And then as we get into something like collections with the lending products, you know, if a customer is experiencing difficulties, are your collections team fully unpacking what those difficulties are? Not just I can't pay, but okay, why can't you pay? You've become a carer, you've had bereavement, etc., etc. So really drilling in with the customer and understanding what the issues are.
We've had a great question come in that I'd like to address to both of you, that that an individual said that there's a great culture and there isn't a great culture regarding customer vulnerability. How do you suggest to improve this culture and to impress upon them the importance and significance of culture and especially approach to vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, I never like to lead with firms around you're going to get fined or you're going to get enforced against. I mean, we have seen fines in this space. We've seen some quite significant ones in this space. And equally, I'm a Section 166 skilled person, and a lot of the requirement notices are having vulnerability in there as well. So I think definitely the writing is on the wall that the regulator is going to enforce in this space, and is going to enforce quite broadly across the areas of vulnerability and the areas of vulnerability control. It's always difficult because firms, if they're closed-minded, will think it's never going to happen to me, you know. And as I said earlier, it's not in the handbook, so I don't care about it. But if your compliance, if you're trying to focus people's minds, you know, SMCR reasonable steps is always an important one. You know, they are, senior management are on the hook for this without question.
You've always been an advocate of making sure that there's tone from the top. So the adoption, Adrian, of a changing culture must come from the top, but the regulators also emphasizing tone from within, and that has actually come through the latest 5 conduct questions published by the regulator there. And it's both, there's an expectation from tone from the top, but also tone from within.
Yeah, look, you know, for me, I think Frank's right. To lead with the fines thing is, yeah, okay. It's a weak argument, though. It's obviously a real argument. I would just pose, hopefully, a thought-provoking question about, think of a brand that's fallen from grace recently, and how quickly did the digital economy in which we operate facilitate a brand going from respectable to not respectable? For example, let's pick something not in this, which is particularly in London. If you take Uber, a couple of years ago, Uber was the savior. It was fantastic. And now Uber's almost a swear word. So if your business trades on its reputation, I would suggest to get this sort of vulnerability stuff wrong is inviting really poor public feedback. And this isn't just from a customer point of view. You know, the youth, the youngsters today are vetting employers. If you're attracting poor publicity around your treatment of people who need your help, they'll take their labour somewhere else. And they really, really will. And we were talking earlier about city firms struggling to attract candidates, full stop. I think if you're in the box where you're doing bad stuff to vulnerable people, your reputation is going to suffer, and it's going to suffer now quicker than ever before in history, because it's so easy to publish this information and access that information. So I would go with a reputational risk perspective. And that reputation, by the way, is not a function of the top table. That's a function of everybody in the business and the choices that they make every time they interact with a customer. And I recognize that training, I don't have the training to do this, so I'm going to make some decisions based on my actual competency today, but it is a collective responsibility. So like you say, tone from the top, tone from within, but reputation I would lead with. Frank,
just want to riff off the back of what Adrian's saying there. Regulator talks about purpose, first raised or mentioned in the 2019-2020 FCA business plan, but this is clear front and center stuff for organizations to really get their heads around, so their business models are not just mapping to the P&L, but also to the FCA's objectives, so saying that you're just more here for the bigger societal impact rather than just the profit of your customers, and that reflects and should be reflected in your approach to vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're a good Catholic, you'll know the concept of sort of sins of omission and sins of commission, and I think that's an important consideration. So you've got the ensuring the fair treatment of the vulnerable customers you identify and you find within your organization is incredibly important, but equally don't exploit vulnerable customers. And unfortunately, we do still see quite a lot of firms out there who have exploitative business models. I mean, the regulator uses a term which I'm not massively keen on, of sludge practices, is the way they describe it. And examples there on the screen. So it's things like the information asymmetries, behavioral biases, inexperience, customers in financial difficulties. I mean, you look at, a lot of, say, high-cost short-term credit, for example, a lot of subprime lending, the bad practices within it, and there are good practices within it as well, is around customers in financial difficulties. They can't go elsewhere, therefore they get high rates. Equally, things like time pressures. If you're a mortgage broker, a mortgage underwriter, and your only USP is quick completion, then you are catering for a specific market of customers who may have some difficulties, some challenges. The fear of missing out, I mean, that is pretty much the entirety of Bitcoin these days, is a sort of fear of missing out side of things. So if thinking very hard and very honestly about the products you're offering to the marketplace, and it's just saying, can I stand this up? Would I want to be justifying this to the regulator if they came in?
And when we look at who is responsible, who's leading this in firms, I'd be quite interested to know from the audience perspective, who's leading this in your firm. Is it risk compliance? Is it legal? Or is it senior managers? Is it the board leading this meeting of the FCA's objectives here? Frank, it should be all of the above is probably the appropriate answer, but where does it really sit, honestly?
Yeah. I mean, as far as the regulator is concerned, they will always say your senior management functions, if you're under SMCR, should be driving this without question. But that does drop down quickly within the firm. I mean, who should be doing this on a day-to-day basis without question is in your first line. So your operational people. So if you have a sort of chief operations officer or head of sales or something like that, they should be front and center within this. And as the slide's saying there, it does cut across so much of FCA regulation. So much can be brought in. And again, this comes back to the idea about they're probably going to enforce on this because there's so many areas they can jump in on. So they can jump in on the principles. So principle 2, principle 3 are part and parcel of this. You did not know what was going on. You did not have an appropriate process in place. You didn't monitor those processes. Obviously, we've got COCON, so we see IC4, customers' interest, again, SC1, effective control, the whole SMCR concept of reasonable steps, and we see reasonable steps echoed within consumer duty as well as we talk about that. And the point I mentioned about TCF, this is not a bolt-on. This is you demonstrating your TCF works.
A lot to for firms to grasp hold of, especially when you're looking at compliance? And somebody posted in the chat also, sorry, in the Q&A, the issue of trying to marry it and align it with GDPR. Is there one eye on other regulations and other rules and other expectations, as well as trying to marry this? And is it compatible, or firms are struggling with that compatibility across the expectation over the rules that you've listed here and the expectations that the regulator has stipulated?
I mean, GDPR is a tricky one, and I know a couple of people have mentioned it, and certainly if you look at the guidance, they've got a good section on GDPR in there. You know, recording information correctly, recording information accurately is incredibly important, and equally to extrapolate on that, being able to have that single customer view across the organization is incredibly important, because it's enormously frustrating for a customer to say, I've told 3 operators about this before, I'm still telling you this. It's incredibly frustrating. If you are recording stuff, you know, don't extrapolate from it, I think is one thing. So that, you know, saying customer is, I'm having to repeat things to the customer, you know, I've told the customer before, therefore they've probably got dementia, is not the sort of ideal thing to be saying, certainly. So you're not a medical expert, but record what you hear, what you understand, and it is reasonable to put a flag on there if you feel that that the customer needs more support.
And somebody's alluded to it already in the chat, that many of the responsibilities of vulnerability sits in the first line as well, but it's a team effort on this. First, second and third line, Adrian, have a role and responsibility to ensuring a risk-based approach to vulnerability.
Yes, I'm going to say it's a holistic approach. I told you I'm getting into the webinar. I'm running out of time. So yes, I'm just going to pick up on one point. From Frank's earlier discussion point, which was financial sophistication, and it seems to me that with some appropriate training, every person in your business would relatively easily identify an individual who lacked financial sophistication. And I wonder, because it's such an easy thing to just zoom in on, I wonder how many, I mean, I'm not asking to do a poll, but I wonder how many people on the webinar would say, you know what, I'm really confident, 10 out of 10, our people would understand what that meant and would be able to spot it and would know what to do about it. I think ask those 3 questions, and my instinct is it's low. And actually, it should be really high, because for me, it's one of the most obvious areas, of weakness, irrespective of where you are. 1, 2, 3 lines. So in a roundabout way, it's holistic. It's holistic.
Frank, is hybrid working impacting or affecting, and if so, how, the approach of firms to vulnerability? And is that challenging, the 3 lines of defense?
Yeah, without question. I mean, the ability of first line management to sort of effect control, effect oversight of teams is inherently compromised with a remote working model. So managers have to work harder to make sure things are happening effectively, and equally second and third line have got to work harder in terms of monitoring. We come back to the concept of culture. I mean, culture is what happens with an organization when management and compliance are not in the room, and there's an awful lot of rooms these days which management and compliance are not in because people are working at home. So culture is a lever of control, not wishing to sound too Orwellian, but it is an enormous factor in making sure that people will do the right thing, even though somebody's not looking over their shoulder.
And when we look at almost like checklist of what firms should be doing, on the left hand side we've got hygiene factors 1 to 5 there, and on the right hand side we've got differentiators, and these are distinct possibilities and opportunities that firms should be meeting or exceeding on the right hand side, points 6 to 10 there. I'd be interested to see, Frank, where you see the percentage of firms really adhering to A, the hygiene factors, and B, the differentiators.
I mean, most firms are on a journey to getting the hygiene factors right. And the firms that do get the hygiene factors right, unfortunately, many of them think that's where the journey stops. So I've got a vulnerable customers policy. I feel very happy with my controls here, or I've trained my frontline staff on the Texas model, so therefore I've ticked the box of vulnerable customers. So, I mean, going back to one of the points in the chat about making it real for people, this sort of unpacking from baseline, everybody should be doing this, to what it actually means to do it properly, is that real sort of differentiator and that real sort of pull that you can have within organizations to say, where we are is not where we should be by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Adrian, you'll probably pick up, and I'm putting words into your mouth to because of time. Point number 7 there, senior managers evidencing under SMCR reasonable steps, the fair treatment of vulnerable customers there.
Yeah, I just wonder what they're going to rely on. If what you're relying on is, here's the 30-minute online training that we put people through, that's what we've done. I would say that it's going to fail a test.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at how, riffing off what Adrian said, how confident are your staff and how equipped are your staff to deal with vulnerable customers, be interesting to see what the audience thinks of that, whether they say yes, they're confident to a degree, or no, or not applicable. And for those organizations that have said yes, it'd be quite interesting to say, what are you doing to say that you're confident and you feel that your organization is equipped to deal with vulnerability there. Okay, let's post up results. And 79% saying to a degree, yep, we're pretty confident and well equipped to deal with this. No, yes, 15%, and no, 6%. Frank, are you surprised by that?
I think, as I say, people are on a journey, and most people, I think, could confidently say, to a degree of confidence. I think in their hearts, they're probably at the lower end of to a degree of confidence. But yeah, I think that ownership and that acknowledgement that, yes, there's still work to do is entirely appropriate.
Firms that you've been working with, would they answer it similarly to what we see on the poll there, Adrian?
I think unless your name's General Custer, yeah, you are going to answer along the lines of to a degree or no. No offense to those who said yes, but it seems to me to be a heroic stance given the complexity of the legislation. So I think, to Frank's point, everyone's on a journey to a degree. The devil is in the detail, and I think it comes back to how much importance, because this is just one thing, as Frank said earlier. This is just one element of the legislation affecting these firms. It just comes back to how much importance has been attached to this. Because if the importance that's been attached to it is we've trained the people, we've ticked the box, we've got the mechanical stuff sorted, we've done it, then that to a degree is going to fall well short, in my opinion. If, on the other hand, firms are looking at it saying our reputation's at risk if we get this wrong, I suspect they're probably further along that to a degree.
Worth reminding our audience of final notices, Frank, and also how the FCA will be enforcing this expectation. Okay, I think we've lost Frank there.
Frank doesn't appear to be on.
Okay, yeah, we've lost Frank there. But we were going to say in this slide, and we are going to say in this slide, that there have been there was a recent enforcement action against an organization last year. So absolutely, definitely thinking that that your approach to vulnerability, as Frank said at the top of this webinar, in its principles will have a potential outcome that all firms should be considering in their approach to vulnerability there. And I think this gives a renewed approach personally to review and look at the conduct rule training that you undertake in your firm, but also your approach to SMCR. So a great opportunity to actually look at that through the lens of vulnerability there. We were going to look at a consumer duty, but I just wanted to jump off, and we may be able to catch Frank at the back end of this webinar, but really wrapping up and being able to say, okay, right, what's the next steps, in your opinion, Adrian, that firms really need to undertake to do things differently from what they perhaps looked at through the deluge of regulation and compliance and expectations that they've seen in 2021? What are they going to do differently in 2022 when they approach vulnerability?
I think if they value reputational importance, I would, and I'm bound to say this, I would look at your most powerful asset, which is your employee base, yeah, and your first line of defense, and say, get that right. Yeah, that's why it is your first line of defense. Yeah, get your first line of defense right. Yeah, and I suspect that to do that, there are quite a few moving parts you're going to have to harness. And as to what Frank said, it is certainly culture. Yeah, it is going to influence your culture. If you took the time and effort and decided that the outcome you wanted was to have a group of employees, all of them, yeah, capable and competent and understanding how vulnerable customers affected them in their role, such that they can offer help and support to those customers and identify them, I think you're well on the way to cracking this really quite difficult nut.
What we've done is listed a number of opportunities where you can engage with both Bovill and also Elephants Don't Forget in reviewing and auditing your existing approach to vulnerability. It'd be great to get a sense check of where you are as a firm, but also have the opportunity to identify, and I think somebody's posted in, how do we go beyond compliance training, 30-minute e-learning, as you put it, to address the moving and the shifting expectations of the regulator on vulnerability and the new consumer duty. So if you'd like to review or audit existing policies and training, please tick the first box there, and colleagues from Bovill will reach out and discuss that with you. The second opportunity is to actually say, well, look, we talked about the importance of training the first line, but it's not just training the first line, it's training the whole organization. So you have an expectation for the whole focus of the organization to have that vulnerability lens approach, as Frank has said. And then you have the opportunity to access a range from both organizations on this webinar: papers, blogs, podcasts, and webinars on vulnerability and your approach to vulnerability. Adrian, we've got a lot of questions in the chat as well as the comments there, and some which probably we need to take offline. Is there any particular ones that you think we could address in the last minute or so of this webinar?
To be honest, I'd have to go through and read them, Philip. What's that? I'm just looking at that one.
Yeah, there's a lot on there. Sorry, guys, my computer just crashed, which was annoying, but I'm back. But I think we probably do need to sort of go through and enrich those answers.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, welcome back, Frank. We were going to touch upon, do you want to just wrap up with consumer duty, just a nod to what the regulator said yesterday, and also perhaps what firms will be quite keenly thinking about definitely in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, certainly with consumer duty, it was interesting the way they did it round, actually, putting vulnerable customers first and then consumer duty. I mean, in some respects, consumer duty should have gone first. It is, I mean, we talked about vulnerable customers being wide-ranging, but consumer duty is going to be significant. I mean, we have a new principle which is something they haven't done for a long time. And then we have this sort of concept of cross-cutting rules, this idea that you must act in good faith to customers, you must avoid causing foreseeable harm. And this concept of foreseeable harm is going to be an interesting one for firms to unpack, and enable and support retail customers with their objectives, and that very much pivots to vulnerable customers. We've then got the outcomes, so product and services, price and value, understanding and consumer support, building products that fit for purpose. And again, I mentioned prod earlier. You know, prod has some of these elements to it, but it doesn't apply to all financial services products. So they are now very much front and center, putting those sort of prod concepts across all financial services products. And as I always say to firms, think about your business model here. How is this going to affect your business model? Yeah,
definitely. Thank you very much. Good roundup and good wrap up. Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you for joining us. I know it's challenging on the IT front sometimes there. That's all what we've got for you. But if you did want to stay on and just pose a question to any of our panelists, please use the chat function or the Q&A function. We will have a couple of minutes to stay online there. PDF version of the slides will be made available by the end of the week alongside a recording there, and also will reflect on your very good questions that you've posted in both the chat and the Q&A section there. And thank you very much, Edward. Thank you very much, Paul and Lisa, for your kind comments, and Hannah as well there. And yes, hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you for participating in this Bovill and Elephants Don't Forget joint webinar as well.